If you're talking about it, we're talking about it. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're still now number one of this live broadcast. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Thank you guys for joining us. Big thank you to our TNT chat community. We've had well over 100 people in the chat room last couple of days, so great to see the numbers building up there. It's a real indication of the audience that's growing as well at this new time slot here since we've relaunched the program just a month ago. So anyway, thank you guys for rejoining us. Now let's pivot into geopolitics right now, into the Middle East. I want to welcome onto the program Leila Hatoum. She's a journalist and also editor-in-chief of MENA UNCENSORED. It's a new media outlet that's being launched as we speak. Leila, thank you for joining us on TNT this week.
It's always a pleasure being on your show. Thank you for having me.
No, the pleasure is all ours, but we've got a lot of stuff to get into here, and I got a lot of questions for you, Leila. Let's start off with the breaking news. Earlier today, we heard, a big kerfuffle that a ceasefire deal was agreed by Hamas. Al Jazeera initially broke the story. There's more to this, though, than the headlines, and now some of the details are coming out. You've been following this pretty closely as it's been breaking. What has actually happened with this announcement?
Well, the thing is, the breaking news at the moment is that the Israelis have announced that they're going to invade Rafah, and they have mobilized their tanks and their air force, and they're moving towards Rafah, and khalas, that's it. Like, they're going into war, and they had already warned people earlier today. However, I'm going to go a little way back to the ceasefire. For the past 2 months, I've been telling people there will be no ceasefire. Hamas is adamant at the four conditions that it has put on the table, and rightly so. They have asked for all border crossings to be open and allow all humanitarian aid to come in. They have asked for displaced people to go back to their hometowns, and that basically the Israelis withdraw from all of Gaza. At the same time, they've asked for a permanent ceasefire and the release of all of the detainees. On the other hand, the Israelis have said no, no, no to all. They have said, we will allow an increase in the humanitarian aid that comes into Gaza, but they didn't say by what percentage. They said we will release some of the hostages, or basically the detainees we have on our part, the Palestinians, instead of releasing all the 10,000 detained Palestinians in Israeli concentration camps. They're going to release some heavyweights, and not to their own hometowns, but they want to banish them to Gaza. And the other thing is that they did not agree to a full ceasefire. It's basically just temporary. And at the same time, that there will be no withdrawal from Gaza until after the 120th day, which is basically the last stage of the deal that they had put on the table. Now, Hamas had taken the deal, and they were supposedly studying it throughout the past week. And I do have contacts on the ground, not only among the political milieu of Hamas, but also the fighters on the ground and the people behind the rooms as well. And they have told me, we will never agree to a temporary ceasefire. We will never agree to not opening the borders and not allowing our people in to the lands that they have been displaced from. And we most certainly will not agree to a deal that does not see the Israelis withdraw from all of Gaza. So since then, I've been sitting on the back and telling people there will be no ceasefire, there will be no deal, because the Israelis are adamant at half, basically, agreements. So by the time that the Israelis and the Americans played the media that Hamas is the one shooting down the negotiations deal rather than the other way around, Hamas actually made a big U-turn, and they used the Israeli tactics against the Israelis. So they Israelified the deal themselves. They used Al Jazeera as a media outlet, supposedly because it has close ties with Hamas and basically they have their support. They ran a piece of propaganda in Al Jazeera that they had agreed to the deal. They put Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of the Israeli entity. It's not a state, by the way, because it doesn't have fixed borders until now under international law. So they put him on the spot. Netanyahu cannot sustain staying in power the moment that they have a deal. He needs war to continue. So he was damned if he agrees to what Hamas had said that they agreed to, and damned if he doesn't. People on the ground have been rallying their troops, the families of the hostages, the Israeli hostages. They have been rallying their people on the ground against Netanyahu. The streets in Tel Aviv and other areas are against Netanyahu. They want, or they're demanding, that their families be back from basically captivity in Gaza. And the moment that Hamas said that they had agreed to the deal, people inside the Israeli entity were happy. And then Bibi Netanyahu looked at the conditions that Hamas had put, and it was like, we're not agreeing to this deal. There are certain things in it that we didn't agree to. So it was a deal that was born dead from the beginning. And basically, the moment he said that there's no deal, the streets were rallied against him. And of course, Benny Gantz was the first rat to jump ship. Benny Gantz announced that he's going to leave the government. And for those who don't know what Benny Gantz is in this whole equation, he's the one who's being supported by the US at the moment to be the next prime minister, the contender for Bibi Netanyahu. And the moment that Benny Gantz announced that he's going to withdraw from the cabinet, that means one thing, that the Americans have taken the full cover off of Bibi Netanyahu, which means we will see more movement on the ground inside the Israeli entity against the government and against Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, what did Benjamin Netanyahu do? He was preparing for a short military attacks in Rafah to pressure Hamas at one point or another. He started by earlier this day having his air force throwing basically pamphlets and flyers telling people to move from South Gaza, which is basically Rafah city, all the way to Mawasi in central Gaza Strip. He was rounding people out to go to the center, and he said, we're going to do an attack. How do you actually announce an attack from midday when you're still waiting for a reply from Hamas that could be positive? Which tells you the intention of Bibi Netanyahu. He always wanted that kind of an attack, though albeit small at any point or another, but he needs that war to continue. So the moment Hamas actually indirectly rejected that deal by pushing him to reject it, he mobilized his troops on the ground. However, also, the Israeli media had been hyping it as a full invasion of Rafah, and I've been telling people it's not a full invasion of Rafah. They have a few dozen tanks that are moving with a heavy cover from the sky because the Israelis cannot sustain having heavy injuries or casualties on the ground inside Rafah. Rafah city is more militarized than North Gaza. It has buildings, it has lots of things in it, so the tanks can't maneuver, and it will be a death trap for the troops. They have hundreds of troops and basically dozens of tanks and a heavy air force. What they're going to stick to, and this is what I've been saying since the beginning, is southeast Khan Yunis, which is basically the empty area that they have cleaned up over the past period, and east of Rafah and southeast of Rafah. They're trying to take over Philadelphia Crossing, which the Egyptians at the moment handle, but they're not going to venture deep into Rafah city. Otherwise, it is them committing suicide. The infrastructure for Hamas is still intact over there. There was no fighting, remember? At the same time, nobody knows how strong Hamas is in South Gaza. In North Gaza, until today, they continue to fight despite the fact that the Israelis had wiped out most of the infrastructure over there. So you can imagine how strong Hamas is when it comes to Rafah. The moment you have high number of casualties among the soldiers inside Rafah, among Israeli soldiers inside Rafah, that means it's bye-bye Bibi Netanyahu. The people on the ground will actually shoot down their own government. And this is the situation.
So listen, a big question there that you brought up, which is, I think, really important. This conundrum that Netanyahu's in, if he stays the course on this, he may stay in power. But in terms of the international support for Israel, it just continues to sink at home and away. It's sinking and sinking as they're on this warpath. So there's no good options for Israel. They're literally stuck in a death spiral politically, both home and away. So this is an important point that you brought up as well. But even more important is this fact, as you pointed out something that's really important, Leila, is that Israel's always used this negotiation tactic, which is to blame the other side for turning down a great deal or we gave them a great deal and they turned it down. So this is a masterstroke, if what you're saying is true, by Hamas. They've absolutely played the Americans, the international media, and the Israelis at their own game, and using Al Jazeera, which is a powerful tool. So to have access to a powerful media outlet like that, and the way the negotiations are structured in this way, they're able to maneuver that. That to me is incredible. I haven't heard anybody put it into that perspective, Leila. But as I have you here, and as you're speaking to a Western audience, we never hear about Palestinian hostages. Never. Never. The U.S. media, Western media, is all about Israeli hostages. This could be over. Hamas could stop the killing if they just handed over the Israeli hostages. So tell us, what kind of hostages do the Israelis have on their side that you know of?
Well, over the past 7 months, the Israelis had ramped up detaining Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, and as well, basically in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And you have to understand, we're talking about thousands of people. That includes hundreds of children under the age of 13, as well as women. And those are civilians. They have nothing to do with anything. Some of them are students, children under the age. I mean, at one point or another, a month and a half ago, they detained a child that was basically 8 years old. And they detained them under what you call administrative detention, which means they can keep them in prison for 6 months renewable at any point for no charges at all. This is only applicable to Palestinians. They detain Palestinians without any charges, and they continue to renew it every single time. That's why among the population in the West Bank, even in Jerusalem, at any point, you'd find one in every house that has been detained since he was a child. Sometimes they detain children as young as 5 years old. Those are detainees. You have now hundreds of children and women that are currently stuck in Israeli, we call them concentration camps because you cannot send a child to prison. Those are concentration camps. God knows what they do to them inside, especially basically with all the information that even the Western media had covered at one point or another, the pedophilia capital of the world. Pedophiles from the US fly over to Israel and they get immunity over there. Doesn't make any sense. Why would you detain a child that's under the age of 13, even under the age of 18? For no crime at all, just administrative detention. Then they have basically, those are who are the political detainees at any point. Those who had expressed ideas that they want a free Palestine, they want their own state, they want a two-state solution at any point, they would detain them. People who show signs of brilliance, they would detain them or kill them. And I'll give you an example. I had an interview today with Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta is one of the brilliant British Palestinian minds. He's a doctor, he's a war surgeon. He's been a war surgeon for the past 25 years. So that's quarter a century. He's also basically a plastic and reconstructive surgeon who takes care of trauma injuries at one point or another. He was in Gaza for the first 43 days of the war. He saw atrocities being committed, and he told us about those who were detained. Guess what? At the moment, 100 of his own medical crew, 100 nurses, doctors, and paramedics are detained by the Israelis that he knows of, that he discovered their names on the list that was prepared by Amnesty International while he was flying to France on Saturday to actually speak about the illegal detention and the war crimes that are happening in Gaza. And he discovered that his own crew, all 100 of them, have been detained by the Israelis. Nobody knows where their whereabouts. And he said something that actually broke my heart. He said, they killed my friend, Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, who was one of the top orthopedic surgeons in the world. They detained him and they killed him in Gaza. And he says, I fear that the killing of Dr. Adnan al-Bursh would be the first step towards killing those 100 paramedics, nurses, and doctors. Why? Because the Israelis have already killed 400 of the top surgeons and doctors and medical consultants over the past 7 months in Gaza. So those are the kind of detainees we're talking about. 100 medical crews. You're talking about children, you're talking about women, you're talking about poets, you're talking about basically people who believe in basically two-state solution at one point. The Israelis don't want that. They don't want thinkers. They don't want people to actually live in peace. They're detaining civilians.
And we saw some horrific news. I mean, it has happened every month or so. You see a beautiful young woman arrested at 15 or 16, arbitrarily detained and completely disappears. And the family's like, what just happened? It goes into the press, no action coming from any of the Western bodies or anything like that. I mean, what on earth are they doing? So these are legitimate questions that people should be asking right now. And they've been allowed to get away with this, Leila, for a very long time, decades, in fact, and to act with total impunity. And so this story is not being told when we're talking about the framing of this hostage exchange. It's almost as if, you know, they claim that the 120 odd, there were probably a lot more Israeli hostages, but Israel has killed at least 30 of them, to our knowledge. But no talk of the thousands and thousands of Palestinian hostages held in these gulags right across Israel, and many of them women and children. So, I mean, where is the international outrage? I don't see any. And the fact that this is not being reported by the press is one of the greatest injustices and the greatest malpractice, journalistic malpractice examples I can possibly think of. And that's a difficult that's a difficult list to top, and they've done it here.
They tried to send information to mainstream media and international media, and they never carried them out. This is why we started MENA Uncensored, because we wanted to run uncensored news, unfiltered news, and news that aren't heavily cut and edited by international media, that plays based on an agenda. I mean, we saw the semantics and the terminologies they use. It's always hostages for the Israelis, but it's always prisoners when it comes to Palestinians. It's always killed for a Palestinian, murdered or brutally mutilated basically for an Israeli. It says basically alleged rape. When it comes to an actual rape case that has been proven by science against a Palestinian woman or child or even a man, and I've ran those stories since October 7 until today. And then when it comes to Israeli propaganda about somebody being raped, they have been raped. No allegations, no nothing. So it's the semantics and the terminologies that the Israeli media and the international community had been running in their own media. That's complicity. They're trying to cover up for every single atrocity and war crime that the Israelis are doing. Well, guess what? Now you have a new media outlet, and we're not going to play by the rules. We're going to use our own words.
Yeah, and as they say, every accusation is a confession coming from the Israelis. That's certainly been the case since October 7th. Glad to see that you and your team are going to be hitting that pretty hard. Now, the other issue, and I want to get your opinion on this, Leila, because we saw reports in the last 24 hours. Axios was the first to break this in the U.S. The U.S. is planning to put a hold on ammunition shipments to Israel coming out of the Biden administration. What are we looking at here? I see you're very skeptical of this. Explain.
They always speak about it. If you remember 2 months back, they said we're contemplating not sending weapons to the Israelis. And after that, they approved a multi-billion dollar project at the Congress level and sending basically not only money, but also ammunition and every single thing that you can actually imagine under the sun. At the end of the day, the US is run by its own lobbies. And those lobbies are the arms lobby, the energy lobby, basically food lobby at any point, you name it. And whenever there's war, you have those lobbies basically moving in, and they want a piece of the pie. And that means basically they need to sell more weapons. They would need to test new weapons as well. You saw back in 2006, Israeli aggression against Lebanon. They tested the two-ton bombs against the Lebanese. It was the first time that they used them. Vacuum bombs and two-ton bombs, the bunker busters, they called them. They perfected them. They were shooting videos on how the bombs were literally were faring on the ground. The Israelis were shooting videos of where they were using these bunker busters, and they perfected them, and now they're using them against Gaza, the 2,000-pound tons, which is 1.5 tons bomb, right? And then basically they used vacuum bombs. They're using them now against Gaza. The drones, the quadcopters, the ones that have heavy noises, the psychological warfare when you have 24/7 the sound of zzz above your head, 24/7. They tested it on us, perfected it in 2006 for 34 days, and now they've been running it for the past 7 months in Gaza. So the idea is that whenever there is war, they always take footage, try to enhance their weapons based on people's lives. They try to basically sell, the Israelis themselves, they try to sell the Merkava Generation 5. They were shooting videos of it when at the beginning of the war, if you remember. It proved to be a flop. They had to withdraw it. They lost lots of contracts because of it. What did the Americans do in Yemen? They tried to run basically their big drones that are multi-million-dollar worth drones, $9 million worth drones. They were shot down with one $5,000 missile, and suddenly they lost contracts. So the idea is you have war mongers, and those people are basically the lobbies, the war lobbies, the arms manufacturers. And they're losing big time this time in the Middle East. Why? Because this is the first time that you see the axis of resistance unified. Usually each front fights for its own in the past. Lebanon was its own front. Syria was its own front. Yemen was its own front. Iraq was its own front. And Palestine was its own front. This is the first time in the history of this region that the axis of resistance actually joined hands despite their ideological and political differences. And this is what actually gave them enough time to actually last in front of one of the heaviest armed factions on the ground, which is the Israeli occupation forces.
Yeah, no, it is historic in that sense. I mean, our read on this announcement coming out of Washington is the U.S. election is shaping up now, and the Republican-Democrat contrast, if you will, the division is, the talking points are Biden is weak. He doesn't support the Israelis, even though he's given Israel every bit of ammunition and support, military support, to conduct a genocide over the last 7 months. I mean, you couldn't give more than what Biden gave, but that's how it's shaping up in the kind of electoral contest. So what it looks like happened here, Leila, is this has been preemptively put out, this story, to preempt any attempt to not give Israel what it wants, because the uproar it's caused, just having this story leaked out, has created all these alarms across Washington, and people saying, you can't possibly do that. You can't leave Israel in the cold. They're in the middle of a war against Hamas, and they're almost winning. So I think this is a very clever piece of PR here. I wouldn't be surprised if the Israeli lobby is actually behind it. This story being pushed out.
It doesn't matter, no matter what they do. The US foreign policy is always the same, no matter if it's the Democrats or the Republicans behind it. At the end of the day, their foreign policy is to support the Israeli entity because it creates those wars and opportunities for them in the Middle East. At the same time, you have to understand this. No matter what happens, the Americans will not relinquish Israel. They will continue to send basically every single thing that they have to them. Taxpayers' money, arms, finances, whatever they will even raise the veto power. If Jesus Christ comes back and they slaughter him, they will raise the veto power to actually head them, support them, kill Jesus Christ. Again, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The foreign policy is always the same. For them, they have to support Israel. It doesn't matter who's in power in Israel. Now, the Americans are fed up with Bibi Netanyahu. They're going to remove him and put Benny Gantz instead. But when it comes to Israel, they will continue to support it. So that's why I was shaking my head. They will continue to send weapons. They will use elastic words. We're contemplating not sending. We're thinking of cutting off aid. We're looking into it. If they do this, we will do that. It's always elastic words, nothing definitive.
Yeah. And again, with an election year, I just caution everybody, everything that happens from now till November has to also be viewed through the lens of the U.S. political race and all the games that are being played that don't correspond with reality when you're actually looking at the real issues. It's politics, folks. So Fox News, all the mainstream media outlets are jockeying for position for their favorite candidate and party. You've got Biden on one side, Trump on the other, Republicans and Democrats, both war hawks in this case, but different types of hawks. They fly slightly differently, Leila, as you say, but they are the same species, the same animal at the end of the day. I think that's an important distinction to make. Let's go to break in a moment. Before we do, Leila, we have some clips of Israel is hitting targets in and around Rafah. We do have one of these clips. I want to roll this clip real quick from Rafah, and I want to get your comment on what's going on there. Let's go ahead and roll that clip. So what we have here, I'm not sure what type of strike this is. Perhaps you'll be able to give us your best guesstimate on this.
This is from the evening. This is not now. I mean, like, it's nighttime. It's almost midnight in Rafah as well. We have the same time zone when it comes to Lebanon and Palestine. So this is from the evening. I've seen something similar. They were hitting basically the peripheries of a residential area. But the thing is, they did have casualties over there. But they've been ramping up the attacks on Rafah since December, and it picked up over the past 2 weeks as well. You have no less than about 5 to 12 people being killed every day by the Israelis in Rafah itself. So this is not a surprise to me that they continue to attack. They continue to use large bombs at any point. Because they cannot go into Rafah on the ground, they use Air Force. And I don't know if you remember, during one of our spaces, I had said it back in December. One of our contacts on the ground told us that the phase 3 of all of the operations for the Israelis on the ground in Gaza, it's going to be Rafah, and they will mainly rely on the Air Force. They're not going to go on the ground. This is why basically I trust my sources. They told us about phase 1 before it happened, phase 2 before it happened, and phase 3, when they told us that, it was 5 months before it happened. So now we're seeing it over the past 5 months, and it's literally relying on Air Force when it comes to Rafah. Why? Because they haven't annihilated basically the infrastructure for the resistance over there at any point. But I have to remind you of one thing. When it comes to elections year, let the Americans keep their ears and eyes open when it comes to Gaza, because they lost 4 soldiers last week. 4 American soldiers were injured and 1 was killed in Rafah at the Netzarim corridor and the Netzer base that are being built by the American and Israeli troops on the ground in Gaza, along with the floating pier. And the moment that the Americans at any point will announce those deaths as basically a car accident or another basically helicopter falling above what you call the Eastern Mediterranean, like they did with the 5 soldiers that were killed during the beginning of the war when they were attacked by the Iraqi resistance in the occupation base of Al-Tanaf in Syria. The thing is, there will be more U.S. casualties on the ground in Gaza. Remember, you lost 27 men from the Delta Force 4 months back. One of them is the son of a congressman. He went out basically in a press conference and spoke about his son, that we don't know his whereabouts or his friends. One of them is an army general or a colonel, I think, if I remember correctly. So the Delta Force already lost 27 men. The Delta Force had 4 soldiers injured last week in an attack on Netzarim corridor. Today, there was another attack on the Netzarim corridor. There's a reason why the Israelis pulled 5 helicopters to evacuate people from the Netzarim corridor and the Netzar base by the sea in Gaza. It's because there were American soldiers who were injured and 1 Israeli high-ranking officer.
Yep.
That will impact, by the way, elections. That will impact the elections.
And also in the Gulf of Aden, 2 former Navy SEALs accidentally fell off a boat and they couldn't find. I mean, come on, it's ridiculous. But this is how it goes. They can't afford the political cost of anyone announcing any dead U.S. soldiers in these theaters, Leila. It's just the price is too high. So
well, they had the body of 1 floating off the port of Hodeidah in Yemen. But the thing is, those 2 Navy SEALs were sent on a basically what you call a rogue operation, and they were caught. One of them basically was killed. The other one's body is not to be retrieved until now. We spoke about it with the Yemenis. We had Yusuf al-Mauri, if you remember, the correspondent on the ground in Yemen. He spoke extensively about this matter. And the thing is, the Americans, every single time, as you said, they lose somebody, they try to come up with a new case scenario, unimaginable one, how they lost those people.
Yeah, no, and you see it over and over again. The best was the Chinook with all of the Navy SEALs who did the Osama bin Laden raid were taken down, and Fox News turned it into some big anti-Obama story about how Obama's let the country down in Afghanistan, when in fact there is the whole SEAL Team 6 crew who did the alleged Osama bin Laden raid in Abbottabad in Pakistan. So, you can draw your own conclusions. Also, we'll give a big shout out to a new media outlet, which you're a part of, MENA Uncensored. It's just launching as we speak. Leila, you're the editor-in-chief of this. Very much looking forward to the content. We've already seen some of the content you and your team are putting out. We expect there's going to be a whole lot more in the coming weeks and months. But looking over to the United States, Leila, as somebody who's in the Middle East, and you're very deeply involved in this issue for decades, your whole life practically, as are, everybody around you who you live with in your country and in the region. You have family in the region. Everybody is connected to this issue. Now, I've never seen anything like this in America, where you have this broad-based anti-war movement supporting the Palestinians. I never thought I would ever see it in my entire life. And wearing scarves, the whole thing, knowing the issues, very well educated, a lot of sharp young people out there right across the United States campuses. How do you feel when you see this? Just your sort of gut reaction and your general observations on this. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, we're all university students and are basically long time ago, but I'm very proud of what they're doing. At the end of the day, they just brought me back to the days when I was a humanitarian advocate and a student advocate at one point or another. You cannot teach students freedoms, human rights, laws, and expect them basically when they see those things being breached and stomped on, and they sit silent. At the end of the day, the older generation sometimes get tamed by the politicians, and the younger generation, they don't understand what's happening, but it's always the students, the university students mainly, are the ones who are active. They're full of zest, and they're still full of ideals and principles. Before the world stomps their principles and ideals, they actually try to manifest them correctly on the ground. And if you've seen the encampment, I was so proud of them. They were so peaceful. And the encampments, they just chanted, they actually shed light on the Palestinian cause. And they were met with violence. They were met with propaganda by the American media itself. I mean, how low can this be? I've studied the American history in the past, and it was the same students who stood against the killing and the butchering of people in basically Far East. We're talking about the Vietnam War. Who stood against it? The Columbia students. Otherwise, nobody in the US would have heard about it that much. They would have shipped their people to die in Vietnam, and that's fine, because you ship people that serve, again, the lobbies, the arms lobbies, and the politicians. It doesn't serve the country. At the end of the day, you're losing your father. The politician will continue to be a politician and will continue to get paid for every single life that they sent or shipped to be killed at any point. So the idea is that those students are principled. They showed the world that they have a peaceful protest. They did not breach the laws. They had to come up and invent new laws to apply on them, despite the fact that anybody who had studied law, when you issue a law, it doesn't go retroactive. It goes towards the future. They issued new laws to actually stop the students from actually carrying out with their encampments. The other side, the pro-Israeli side, the pro-Zionist side, at one point, they were attacking these students, harming them. We've seen the pictures. The blooded eyes, basically the stabbing at one point, and then nobody covers it from that angle. And suddenly, if somebody passes by one of the pro-Israelis in a protest, the guy was like, oh my God, your whiff of air actually flipped me over. And then you start seeing the mainstream media having them online, hosting them. It's like, oh my God, I felt so threatened because there were 5 people across the street from me. What kind of a story is that? I mean, shame on the US media. I was taught by not only American, but also British and French journalists on how to cover news, international news at one point or another. They always said you cannot run a story that's full with sources and nothing basically on the record. You cannot basically stand against something that's under international law, human rights. You cannot basically go and support dictatorships. Well, guess what? Now we see the US media and the French media and the British media, they're supporting dictatorships at one point or another, justifying sending weapons to dictatorships. At any point, they're supporting killing men, women, children, and basically disabled people on the ground in Gaza. The detention of doctors, torturing them and killing them, they also defend that or basically do a media blackout. The West Bank at the moment, the heaviest fighting had broken in the West Bank since October 7. It's an actual intifada over there. The Israelis have killed over 470 people in the West Bank over the past 7 months. That's 2.5 times the number of Palestinians that were killed across Palestine by the Israelis in 2022. And the media blackout that's performed by the American media is so shameful. So I stand with the students against not only the politicians in the US on this matter, not only against the Israeli supporters, but also against the US media that's trying to spin propaganda against its own citizens. In favor of what? A foreign nation that has caused nothing but death and destruction to the world? It doesn't make any sense. So I do salute them and I do support them.
And, we've had other people from the region. We've heard have said from Iran, from Palestine, they're calling the students heroes for going out and forcing the issue into the national news. So I mean, that's what they're saying from the region. They're complimenting them, saying, please, we need more.
I can tell you one thing. Anybody who claims that they are pro-Palestinian and they stand against this kind of peaceful protests held by the students in the US and across the world is somebody who is trying to insinuate that he's pro-Palestinian, but he's not. Pro-Palestinians are peaceful people who are trying to shed light on a justful cause across the world. The more people talk about it, the more we welcome it. So those who are talking against it and claim that they are pro-Palestinian, you have to question their background.
Yeah, and we see the Fox News is coordinating with a lot of right-wing media and the Israeli lobby to basically discredit the student protests by claiming that because there's somehow a George Soros funded NGO or that's funded by a George Soros Foundation, not even directly funded by Soros, but because they're present at the protest, they're saying that it delegitimizes the entire protest. And
are you talking about media that were funded at one point by Epstein and basically Weinstein and other people? The rapists and the child molesters and everybody else?
I'm not talking about anyone specifically.
If they have a glass house, they shouldn't cast the first stone. If they're actually pointing fingers because a Soros Foundation supported at any point, or they accepted support from a certain foundation that has question marks on it, basically I can pull out at least a dozen companies that support these media outlets and they have blood on their hands. So, I mean, like, they shouldn't be casting the first stone on this matter. It's a matter of humanity at the end of the day. You're either on the right side of history or the wrong side of history. And so far, almost, not all of them, almost all of the mainstream media in the US are studying on the wrong side of history because of political hegemony, because of agendas, and because of who owns them.
It is incredible. It's extraordinary to see people say they're having these spaces on X saying the Patriots strike back, and the frat boys came and pushed the pro-Palestinian. They're calling them Hamas terrorist sympathizers. That's what they're calling the students, and they're saying this is a great act of American patriotism to shut down their First Amendment rights of freedom of speech and assembly. I mean, honestly, Leila, it's quite incredible to witness, but this exact thing happened in the Vietnam protests. Exactly. This is like a repeat of 1968.
But the difference, there was no social media. The difference is that there was no social media, so you could only hear it from the mainstream media. And most of the mainstream media at that time they sympathized with those students at one point or another. People still had ideals. People still were principled at one point or another. They understood the right from wrong. They didn't want death. They didn't want destruction or war. But today, you have the media playing literally, they will paint you the victim as the villain and the villain as the victim. And it's really increasing with the use of AI and all these technologies as well.
Now, we have a couple minutes left, and I have one last question. It's a difficult question, Leila. It's a difficult question. And I'll give you a few minutes to answer it because I think it's important because of the stage that we're at in this story right now. And you're in the region, so you're going to have a very different perspective than, let's say, somebody who's in New York City or, who's in London. Okay. There are people that are in the pro-Palestinian camp that do not want to cease fire, but mostly I see them outside of the Middle East, where they think that this is the opportunity to keep the war going, to destroy the Israeli entity once and for all. And if it means another, 30 or 40,000 dead Palestinians, well, that's a price that the Palestinians need to pay. Now, I'm not saying, I don't know how these wars are going to end up, Leila. We don't predict. We can only observe and say why it happened as journalists. We can say what happened, why it happened, and whether this was a surprise or not. But there's the fine line of advocating for a war because you're almost like playing a video game. Have you recognized this question, and how do you feel about this? Because this is a real problem, I think.
There's not one day that I sleep on the pillow because I do cover also the southern Lebanese front, as you know. I've been covering it since the beginning of this war, and I've covered it back in 2006. I've seen dead bodies, I've seen babies, headless babies. And we do have pictures for them, by the way, and names and their families, and we know where they live. It's not basically something that's a propaganda. And they were carried also by international media, those photos. There's not a single day that I sleep on the pillow and I don't think about, if we continue with this war, where will we reach? And if it stops, where will we reach? But at the end of the day, it's not up to anybody across the world to support or say like they're not allowed to fight or whatever it is. It's up to the people of this region. They know best what they can do on the ground, and they are the ones who decide where they want to take it. At the end of the day, I can tell you from my side, the Palestinians and the Lebanese are peace-loving people. I mean, even look at who was the first to actually give a peace deal. The Arabs were the first to put a peace deal on the table back in 2002, if you remember, that basically called for a two-state solution on the lands of 1967, peace in exchange of land. The Israelis shot it down. The Lebanese and the Palestinians continue to say, we have no problems with Jews. If you want to coexist, one state or two state, doesn't matter, but reach a solution. And every single time the Israelis shot it down, and they continue to kill our people. And when I say our people, I mean my people, the Lebanese, and my Palestinians who are basically in Palestine. So at the end of the day, based on the scenario on the ground, we will either be pushed to fight, because we will not shy away from fighting for our land and our people and our security. But at the moment, we also call for peace. If you want peace, we're ready for it. If you want war, we're ready for it. So for those who are calling for war and they're ready for war, I'm sure that they haven't lost a single family member in front of their eyes. I have. I lost one of my cousins. She was 12 years old back in the 90s. One of the Israelis actually woke up when they occupied most of South Lebanon and decided to practice shoot against one of the peaceful villages. We happened to be basically playing there during the summer holiday, and he basically decided to shoot a missile into that village. It hit our my grandma's home, and she died over there because of the shrapnels. So unless you grew up with an occupation killing your family members and you're still saying we're ready for peace, you wouldn't understand what it means. Peace comes at a very, very high price.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I think it's up to the people who live in a particular country or community is how high they're going to value the lives of the residents of and citizens of those countries. Hassan Nasrallah, Secretary General of Hezbollah, said very clearly, our first priority is to stop the killing. He made that very clear on a number of occasions. So that's coming right from the top of Hezbollah. But as you say, Leila, if the Israelis want to fight, they are ready to fight and defend, but they're ready for peace. I think that's an important fine line, a distinction that gets lost, especially now we're seven months in to this, that we don't want to lose our humanity in the process. You don't want to become the very thing that you are opposing, or that you believe you're opposing. And I think there's always a danger of that. And in this world of digital media, and everybody is playing a virtual simulation sometimes, and they do lose touch. I think people lose touch with what's actually, there's real people at the end. All those leaders have to make those decisions, don't they, Leila? Every day they wake up, they're responsible for every citizen in their community, in their borders. That's not an easy. It's not an easy. There's a lot of people say, why doesn't the axis of resistance go and destroy Israel? Why are the Iranians not, being more aggressive and so forth? Why are the Lebanese sitting back and not hitting it? It's not that simple, is it, Leila? 1 minute left, but go ahead.
It's not a gamble. At the end of the day, you have to weigh your options. When you engage in fighting, it's going to also basically backfire against your own people. So how can you solve it with the minimal damages? You try to advocate for peace. If it doesn't work and they continue to kill you, you have no other option but to fight. And still, when you're fighting, if you look at throughout the history of the resistance from this side of the world, they always targeted military, not civilians, whereas the occupation has always targeted civilians, not military. And how do I know that? You just compare the numbers. We have at one point in 2006, you had about 1,100 people killed. Mostly about 900 to 950 of them, they were civilians. And the rest were basically Hezbollah fighters and movement fighters and other fighters on the ground who were fighting the Israeli occupation that invaded South Lebanon and invaded did an aggression against all of Lebanon at one point or another. Same thing goes for the Palestinians. They don't hit civilian targets. But this is how the international media plays it, unfortunately, that we are the aggressors and they are the peaceful, loving people.
I'm glad we had this conversation. Hopefully we'll continue this very important conversation. Leila Hatoum, Editor-in-Chief of MENA Uncensored, thank you for joining us on TNT this week. There she goes, ladies and gentlemen. Follow Leila on X, formerly known as Twitter, and MENA Uncensored. Got a lot coming up. Top of the hour news headlines. And after that, Nico House is going to join us. Looking forward to this discussion. There's a whole lot more coming up. Stay with us, folks.